Well, Dr. Mark Mayfield, it's so great to have you on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We were just talking about just a second ago off air about the respective places that we are from, and I'm very jealous of where you're living. And it sounds like you're moving, and I'm like, man, just why would you ever move from beautiful God's country of Colorado? But
Yeah,
whew,
I've been here for like 30 some odd years, so it's time for a change of pace, right? I
it's
mean,
time
I
for
got to
a
see more of the
change.
country.
I know, man. I'm over here in the flatlands of Indiana going, why do I live around cornfields when there's like majestic mountains out there? Just, a hop, skip, and a jump over a couple of
Yeah, but
states.
you
But
guys
man,
got more water. You got lakes,
that's
and
true. That's
it's
true.
hard to find that around here.
Summers are wonderful here. They're wonderful here. Winters are where we get kind of, woof, we
Yeah,
just get bogged
right.
down, right? Which, it's interesting. We're going to talk a little bit about that concept. I mean, even just kind of this concept of loneliness and depression and getting to a place where, in your own story, you've been very outspoken about just this season of life where you got to where you're like, I don't know if I want to continue to live. And
Mm.
I know there are a lot of people who are in that space right now. And so we're going to talk about your story in that. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about, before we dive into your story, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do and what's your life look like right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of in transition. It's interesting. I've been a pastor for a number of years, and then jumped into getting my master's and PhD in counseling, and really taking a different
Mm.
perspective of pastoring through the role of counseling. And I've worked many jobs, but the last one was founding a nonprofit counseling center in Colorado here that really meets the needs of the least of these. Did that for 7 years and just moved from being CEO to just about a board member and founder. But really feel like God's leading me to be a church planter for counseling centers. And so we're jumping
Wow.
into a couple different churches in the country that are looking for nonprofit counseling center consulting and support. So I won't be doing any leading. It'll be do more in, the setting it up and the launching of. And so doing that, and then doing a lot of consulting, and now kind of more executive coaching for mental and emotional wellness among
Wow.
teams and congregations, churches, businesses, organizations. So it's been fun to see how it's morphed. Still do a lot of
Yeah.
work with suicide, self injury. But I really feel like mental health needs a different conversation than we've had, because the stigma is still held on quite a bit. And part of the reason I wrote the book on loneliness versus a different topic is I think we need to look at it from a perspective that everybody can understand in a way that is um, maybe challenging but not scary.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so interesting. I love that you're saying, I mean, mental health has become a conversation that it's become in vogue in a lot of ways. We're like becoming more aware of it, and the church is lagging behind, right? But they're
Hmm.
starting to talk about it a little bit. And I'm intrigued, and maybe we go here before we kind of hear your story, or maybe this dovetails when you say that you want to have the conversation in a way that's different than what it has been. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think over the years, I mean, stigma, you think about just the history of our country and kind of the independent spirit. How often do we hear on the news, you're not going to take away my freedoms. I'm going to, all this kind of stuff. And not to put a political spin on things, but just kind of seeing how our country has been since its inception. It's been very much an independent spirit. So when we get to a place where we can't do it, or we are struggling, there's such a stigma around asking for help or saying that I'm not able to do this on my own.
Hmm.
And so we talk about mental health or mental illness, but do we really normalize it to a place that we all can go, hey, I can relate to that, in the sense of, well, I'm not going to be diagnosed with, you know, general anxiety disorder or bipolar or
Mm.
major depressive disorder, but I struggle with some anxiety and fear, and I struggle with some depression, or I struggle
Mm.
with ups and downs. Where's that place for me? Where's that conversation for me? Because I think we've always, I shouldn't say always, I don't like using extreme language like that, but I think often we wait until we're in crisis mode before we reach out for help.
Right.
And my desire is to level the playing field of, let's have conversations about our emotions. Let's have conversations
Yeah.
about um, difficult emotions. There's no good or bad emotions. They're just emotions. And how do we sit
Right.
with those, and how do we walk through those? And How do we talk about failure, loss, and disappointment, which are now
Mm,
thresholds for suicide and self-injury for our teenagers?
mm.
I mean, just a lot of different things where I think our country and just the church in general has done a disservice to this conversation, in my opinion. And not to point
Yeah.
fingers or be totally fatalistic, but I got to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I would agree. I think that as we're working with people through the Pain to Purpose course and we're launching it in churches, we're seeing that this is kind of in some ways, it very much still is a revolutionary concept in the church. There still is a pervasive stigma of, hey, you're not supposed to feel these emotions. If you feel these particular emotions, you're probably not a good follower of Jesus. You're a bad Christian, right?
Right.
And yet we see that God is an emotional God. He wired us with these emotions for reasons, right? They're supposed to indicate something to us to move us toward Him even more.
Well, it's interesting that you said that because I was just I'm writing my next book right now, and um, I was just baffled by this statement. I think when we talk about our emotions, um, is that we don't pay attention to the fact. Well, we hear. I mean, I don't know about you, where how you grew up in the church or where you grew up, but I always heard Jeremiah. Or, let me see if I can find it real quick. Jeremiah 17:9, right? The heart is deceitful
Yeah.
above all else,
Right. Right.
and we hear that. I grew up in a Baptist church. I heard that all the time, and
Yep.
the message that I heard was, our heart is deceitful, our emotions are deceitful, so don't pay
Yeah.
attention to them. Like just pass them by.
Right.
But you don't read the rest of the rest of the chapter is interesting. So I'm gonna read it real quick. It says, the first part. This is the message. The heart is hopelessly dark and deceitful, a puzzle that no one can figure out. But I, God, search the heart and examine the mind. I get to the heart of the human. I
Mm.
get to the root of all things, and I treat them as they are, not as they pretend to be.
Wow.
Why don't we talk about that?
Right.
Right?
Right. Yep.
We take these verses, and so I'm not, that's where I think I got bottled up so much in my own
Yeah.
story was like I'm a very emotional person,
Mm.
and that was not allowed. That was not
Mm.
encouraged. In fact, it was the opposite. And then you hear these types of things spoken from youth group or the pulpit,
Right.
and that narrative that I kept on telling myself was diving me deeper and deeper into
Yeah.
despair.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
yeah. And so I think, I wrote the book to my first book. I wrote that to the church and to the
Mm.
to not just pastors and leaders, but to everyone. And it's just interesting how it's been received. It's been
Mm.
in some circles it's been received really really well, and others, I'm getting criticized left and right of why would I talk. I mean, just probably the same thing with what you do with the Pain to
For
Purpose and
sure.
this podcast, right? You get a kind of a mixed bag of reception.
Right. Well, that's absolutely right. Because I think one of the reasons why the church has been afraid to approach this topic is because we're afraid that in the midst of addressing or peering into our emotions, we're going to forsake God's word, right? The truth that's supposed to be the anchor for our life. And we're going to begin to make decisions that are based purely out of our emotions, right? And so that
Sure.
becomes the fear. So we just diminish it all in general. And we go,
Yep.
no, no, we can't do that. We've got to just hold strong to God's word. And it's like, well, we're doing ourselves and everybody else a disservice by not addressing these things, because actually these emotions give us clues into where we are in our path of, of,
Yep.
of our walk with Christ, right?
Yep.
And where we are situationally, and what kinds of maybe what kinds of idols that we have hidden, buried deep inside of our story that the Lord's trying to reveal to us, and He's trying to expose those things, and He wants us to wrestle with this, and He wants us
Mm.
to. It's a lot more of a lot more of a oh, I don't know what it's not as black and white as what we tend to kind of
Sure.
blanket it as.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I make the argument that if we become more familiar with our emotions, in some ways I call it
Hmm.
like becoming old friends with our emotions,
Right.
that we are actually going to be more Christ-like. Not saying that we're going to let our emotions dictate how we think. That's God
Yeah.
gave us a frontal cortex, a
Right.
thinking part of the brain to decipher and disseminate what is true and what is not, but to
Mm.
dismiss the emotion. But emotions are just, neurophysiological
Hmm.
responses to internal external stimuli. We make meaning based off of that, right?
Yeah.
Culturally, uh, whether it be from our own families of origin, but within the church or whatever. So I don't know why we categorize them as good or bad.
Mm.
They should be just like, oh, like you said, they're indicators. Like,
Yep.
my
Yep.
light came on, my check engine light came on in my car. I
That's
better
exactly right.
figure out what's going on.
Yep, that's exactly right. Well, and ironically, I mean, and we're going down this rabbit trail a little bit. I want to get to kind of your story and how all this became an inspiration to you. But ironically, you talk about the relationship between our emotions and the prefrontal cortex of our brain. I feel like that I've seen and experienced the more that we dismiss our emotions, the more our prefrontal cortex gets shut down, right? And that's what happens in trauma is that our prefrontal cortex, our decision making part of our brain gets shut down, and we all of a sudden start moving into this, really animalistic, instinctive fight, flight, or freeze mode, right?
Yep.
But the more you begin to get curious about your emotions, the more you're able, even in those moments, to down regulate that instinct
Yep. Oh,
and
absolutely.
begin to re-engage the prefrontal cortex because you've done the exercises to go, wait a minute, what am I feeling right now? What is this telling
Hmm.
me about where I'm at right now? How do I begin to, like I said, down regulate some of these things? And so it's ironic that we've been saying, the church has been saying, shove those, don't dismiss those. And yet because of that, now we're firing even more into this less, uh, less human version of ourselves. Right.
Right. Less holistic version of ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, let's dive in and talk to me about your journey a little
Yeah.
bit and how all this plays into it.
Well, I think this is, I mean, I love that question because I think most of us, at least those that I've worked with, we don't validate our stories as much as we
Mm.
should, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but growing up in the church, like, oh, I didn't have I was, on drugs, and then one moment God met me in the street corner, and I, had this miraculous. I mean, I grew up in a Christian home, which was great. I
Mm-hmm.
am so grateful for that and thankful for that. My parents were both Christian educators, but um, I had a lot of attachment disruptions. I was born 2.5 months premature.
Mm.
Back in the 80s, that was, thrown into an incubator and
Right.
no physical contact. And we know that that's vital for attachment bonding and that kind of stuff. And so, um, you know, I, I was a very unique child in the sense that I was very emotional. Looking
Mm.
back on it now, knowing the language I've got, I was, emotionally intelligent earlier on than most,
Right.
but my emotions would come out in just big swaths of
Yeah.
reactions and and that kind of stuff. I'm currently writing about it, and so I was reflecting on like my parents did the best they could with what they knew. Like they were, they
Hmm.
grew up, were raised by Depression era,
Yeah.
parents, and
Rub some
in
dirt
the
on it and
50s and
go.
60s, and so
Hmm.
it's kind of, so I was as I've talked to my parents, that's not what they intended, but what happened was I was dismissed. Go to your room until you calm down, then you come back and
Mm.
be a part of the family type of thing. And so, I go to my room and I'd be crying, and I'd be like, okay, why am I sent away? You create these narratives around your own
Mm.
uh, way that other people react to your emotions, and very sensitive too, in the sense of the highly sensitive person where tags on clothes and
Mm.
chewing and all these kinds of things, all my senses were always firing, and so it was overwhelming very much of the time. But as I got older, so I grew up in California first 10 years of my life, had a lot of really good friends, a lot of great community, small town.
Mm.
But then we moved to Colorado, and you're the odd person out. I looked like a white version of Steve Urkel from the show Family Matters, with my pants real up high and the braces and the glasses. And kids can be cruel,
Yeah.
and so kind of stayed under the radar in fourth and fifth grade, but then got to sixth grade, and just beat up, bullied, made fun of. Was at a Christian school, right?
Mm.
Stuffed in lockers, swirlies, can't called horrible things. I think the memory that really sticks with me was I was in front of class. Teacher stepped out. One of the boys came down and did pants me and took my underwear down with it in front of the whole
Mm.
class.
Yeah.
Just not big T type trauma, but trauma
Right.
that really stuck. Small T trauma that just shame, guilt,
Yeah.
fear. And I didn't have. I know we know that when those kinds of things happen, the Broca's region of the brain, the language part of the brain actually does turn off, right? Because
Hmm.
we're in that fight, flight, or freeze mode, and so we can't put language to it the way we need to. And especially as a middle schooler, I couldn't put language to it. So just kind of suffered in silence, and it turned into a massive migraine headache that started in January of my sixth grade year and lasted for about 6 months. And so, still couldn't put language to it, right? So my mom and dad did what they knew best and took me to neurologists and, MRIs, blood draws, spinal taps, all this kind of stuff, just to go, why
Wow.
is this, in excruciating pain all the time? Um, and I always, in my story, I talk about the idea that I don't know if I was actively suicidal. I just wanted the pain to end, and
Wow.
so um, the probably April of that year, depression at an all-time high, anxiety, fear, the pain was, excruciating. Couldn't put words to it. On medication to try to help with the headaches and stuff, and so,
Mm.
but one night I cried myself to sleep, and I woke up and I'm like, I just need this pain to end. So I went downstairs and searched for a bottle of Tylenol and ended up taking the whole thing,
Wow.
hoping that I wouldn't wake up. I was 12, right? I mean, trying to
Wow.
cognitively think through that
Yeah.
wasn't
Right.
happening. But woke up probably 10, 15 minutes later with excruciating pain in the stomach. I think things had,
Mm.
interacted with each other or whatever. I don't, know fully, but took me to the hospital and had that, throat numbing charcoal crap,
Man.
getting to be able to make sure that it was neutralized. And then I think, but that was when my family was like, okay, this is, and the neurologist was like, this is more than just
Yeah.
physiological. In fact, it's probably not physiological at all. The body's reacting to the internal despair and struggle. And we know from a holistic standpoint that,
Yeah.
our mental and emotional health actually has a direct link and effect on our body.
Right.
And so got into a psychologist with my dad. My dad and I did therapy together. Really repaired and grew up our relationship. I was on
Mm.
medication for my depression for a while, and didn't. I wish I could say it turned around immediately, but it didn't. I mean, it was probably 2 or 3 years until I got into high school and really found a place in like baseball and theater and different things that kind of gave me a purpose that kind of pulled me out of that. Um, and
Wow.
my dad and I joke, he goes, you went from that to getting to be a freshman at college and traveling the world, so
Mm.
just it kind of neat to see the progression. But um, I as I tell the story, it's interesting to me just how on the outside looking in it makes sense, right?
Mhm.
Uh, but and how disruptive and how confusing it was as a 12-year-old looking out.
Mm. Wow. Man, there's so many things, so many rabbit trails I want to take with the story that you just I mean, first of all, it's amazing what you have walked through, and at such an early age, like what you said, where you couldn't put language to it.
Hmm.
On some level, at our age now, if you start to begin to walk through stuff like that, you have some tools in your tool belt to be able to go, okay, I
Sure.
know, I know what I need to be doing here. But man, before you're 12 years old, you're wrestling through all this stuff. I find it very, very fascinating that your migraine headaches, you can now look back and say, no, it was a direct result of this inner turmoil that was happening mentally and emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
Um, can you, for a little bit, explain some of that connection for, you got a DR in front of your name right here. Right? So I know that you've got some education on this, but help our listeners to understand this. We talk about this a lot. We've talked about the body keeps
Sure.
the score. We've talked about some of those concepts, but I'd love for you to explain in terms that we can really wrap our mind around, like what does this mean? What do you mean that my emotions and my mental health is going to affect and manifest itself physically?
Well, I could think of two analogies that can maybe give somebody a visual. And you remember the Pringles can snake trick? You stuff this snake into the Pringles can, and somebody opens it up, and it just comes
Yeah.
spewing out everywhere, and it and fierceness and velocity,
Mhm.
or for those that are a little bit older, you know, uh, you know the Instapot is the new version of
Right.
the pressure cooker that we had
Right.
growing up. My grandmother had one always on the stove and that kind of stuff, and you had to
Which I
have it
was, by the way,
sealed.
very deceived by the Instapot because it's still not very instant. And my wife had to explain
No,
to
it's
me the other
not.
day, no, compared to a pressure cooker, it
Yeah,
is very instant. I'm like, it's still taking like several hours for this thing.
right. Right. Well, yeah, you put a
Anyways,
frozen chicken in there and it'll come out in 2 hours type of, yeah.
right,
But yeah, like, so the snake thing, or but like a pressure cooker, right? And you
right.
can't just open the lid with a pressure cooker. You have to release the valve. But I look at our bodies as kind of that vessel that if we don't have a release
Mm,
valve, or a way to release certain things, it's going to go somewhere,
mm,
right? And we know that, I mean, just very basic, when we are dealing with internal turmoil or external turmoil that is internalized, our body goes into that fight, flight, or freeze mode. Our brain, so there's a part of the brain called the amygdala, it's part of the cortical limbic system that is turned on, and it activates our nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system of like, hey, I probably should be in a protective mode. Something's going on. I can't put my finger on it,
yeah.
but let's be alert. And I won't go into detail what it does, but it gets the body ready,
Hmm.
to go. Um, but if that is not dealt with, right, if that's not a short term, like I just need to protect myself and then I'm going to turn off, my parasympathetic nervous system gets turned on and everything kind of comes back to equilibrium. And then what we have is an adrenal dump and a stress hormone called cortisol
Hmm.
dump, that is kind of left on. It's like that dripping faucet.
Yeah.
And what that does is it keeps us maybe under the surface aroused and alert to make sure that we're protected, but it weakens our immune system.
Yeah.
It shrinks the size of our brain physically, actually, so that our frontal cortex, as you talked about earlier, doesn't have the ability to step in and go, whoa, 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 wait a minute. Like, that's, yes, something's not right, but let's think about why.
Right.
And so it begins to tear away at this foundation. Now I can get into more detail about, the way the body goes and tries to fight those
Mm,
kinds of things. But really, the basic piece is that when we are in turmoil and we don't have a way to release it,
mm,
it has to go someplace. And
right.
typically, it gets stuck in our nervous system and in our organs,
Right.
and it begins to deteriorate.
Yeah.
Right. Um, one amazing study is we can link the health of our cardiovascular system to the health of our relationships.
Mm, wow.
Right. So how much our blood vessels are actually expanded or constricted, um, and how our heart is pumping and working is actually can be linked to the quality and the safety of our relationships.
Wow.
Like that. Like if God, like that, just point back to the,
Yeah.
the way God
Yeah.
intended it. I don't know what does.
Yeah. That's what I love about it. My wife's a medical provider. She's a PA. And so it's really fun to talk with her about this kind of stuff because, and I say this all the time on the podcast, but it's like when I hear things from her on how our body works, I'm like, man, that's amazing how God made it to work like this, right? Whereas
Right.
oftentimes science
Yeah.
and Christianity seem to be in contention with each other. It's like, no, 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 no. This is awesome to discover how God has wired us to
Hmm.
work and the interrelationship between and the integration between our mental health, our spiritual health, our emotional health, and our physical health. And so, case in point, my wife Christy she woke up a couple weeks ago with just like this crick in her neck, and it evolved into having to get an MRI and seeing some terms that I in her C4 C5 that I can't even explain right. And so she's thinking, do I need to get surgery? She's 37 years old. Like, do I have to get surgery on my neck? Well, even as a medical provider, she is cognizant enough in the relationship between her emotional health and mental health and her physical health, to know that I'm not going to necessarily, that's not the first resort that I'm going to go to, right? Let's think about some things. She knew she had been under a ton of stress recently, and so let's think about some other things first, and address these. Not to say that like anytime you have physical pain, you don't need to look at the right. There's definitely situations where that's
Sure.
got to be the case, right? But it's like, I
Right.
guess the point I'm making is, we want to address the whole person. And
Hmm.
that's what the church has failed to do in the past. We've just addressed the spiritual nature. And it's what
Yep.
the medical world has failed to do in the past too. We've just addressed the physical nature. And there's so much more involved here.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. Yeah, and I see it. I mean, I've got countless stories. I've shared quite a few of them in my book, but countless stories of we release the valve,
Mhm.
and the physical symptoms go away.
Right. Right. Now, okay, so to that end, in your story, um, did you see that begin to take place? I know you talked about you and your dad started having counseling and repaired a lot of the relationship right there, and some things where he was misunderstanding, misinterpreting what
Hmm.
was going on. How did that begin to happen in your story? Did you see as the release valve was being opened up that physical manifestation of these things began to subside?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was put on Prozac for a couple months to kind of help stabilize, and then it's interesting when we're able to put words to our stories. It's this is not rocket science, and
Mm,
that's where I tell people like, I'm glad that I'm a counselor, but really the church should be the one leading the charge in this. And there's basic,
right,
simple tools you don't need a master's or a PhD for,
right.
and one of them is just unlocking somebody's
Yep,
story.
that's
And
it.
so asking curious questions, not trying to fix or give advice, just leaning in, and wanting to know. And so I think I was able to put some words to my story finally,
Wow.
that helped unlock a lot of that pent up or backlog of stress, of fear, of pain,
Yeah.
of sorrow, depression. And like I said, it was a process because I don't know about you or your listeners. I don't do well with small talk in relationships. I
Yeah.
do well, like I like to go deep with people. I like to get to know their stories.
Right.
And so it was always been hard for me to make friends because most people are afraid of that
Yeah.
connection,
Yeah.
and so it wasn't like I, had all this happen and, boom, I had a best friend and we were great. Like I don't think I really had a really close friend,
Mm,
you know, before my wife, and then after that, a guy friend didn't really happen until probably about 7 or 8 years ago.
mm,
So it wasn't like this. I want people to understand. It's not that like the heavens opened up and everything was better.
yeah.
It was I was able to put words and language to my story, recognize that I wasn't broken
Yeah.
or something wasn't severely wrong with me. It was just here's what happened, and I began to be comfortable and confident in my own
Mm,
skin.
mm. Yeah, and I think that's particularly difficult for men. For whatever reason, we are the gender that is labeled as, or our typecast is that we're supposed to not talk about emotions, not talk about the things that are going on, right? And we find that so often, right? I mean, I was just leading a workshop this past Monday where a guy raised his hand, and I'm continually talking about, hey, we need to address our emotions, we need to look into them, we peer into them, we need to, let's gain an emotional vocab beyond the 6 words that we know. That's like I'm mad, happy, angry, right? Like
Right.
so, this guy was like, but I don't know how to do that, right? And all the men in that room were echoing that same thing, and their wives are just like sitting there on edge because they're wishing, they're like, can you give them some kind of insight, please? Because we want this so badly for them to be able to express their emotions. But it is like it's more. I feel like it's very difficult for us as men. I'm a wing 4 on the Enneagram. I have no idea if you know Enneagram or what you, but because
Oh
of
yeah,
that,
I
I
do.
am
Yep.
very much, I feel things deeply. And I found that it's difficult in just a machismo type culture sometimes to go, man, I don't know how to connect sometimes in conversation with men
Yep.
because it's all about these surface level things. And I want to get to the heart of the matter on some things,
Oh yeah.
you know?
Yeah. The genuineness of it. And I think that's where our society has done a disservice and the church has done a disservice. And so I love that there are many, many more organizations, churches, groups that are having these conversations, right? So it may not happen on the national stage. It's going to happen in the communities. It's
Yeah.
going to happen in the grassroots areas, and that's what I love about it.
Yeah. You said something that really perked my interest too, and you kind of glossed over it a little bit, but you're like, once I began to find some purpose in some things, it helped to pull me out of it. And I
Hmm.
wonder if you can talk about that a little bit, because we issue all the time that is an essential component to you walking through your valley is finding and
Oh yeah.
identifying what purpose and meaning can be formed from this, and then walking in that purpose and meaning. Talk to me about your
Yeah, I
experience.
yeah, I talk about kind of just, in my opinion, the three components of walking out of loneliness is
Mm,
this idea that we need to know whose we are, our identity, right?
yep.
And I think in a society we always talk about who am I,
Mm,
and I think that's a decent question, but I think we're not going to answer that fully unless we ask ourselves whose we are, and
that's
you know,
good.
and that can be answered in a bunch of different ways, right? As believers, we answer that in that we are. redeemed sons and daughters of the Most High God, and but anybody can answer that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I am, uh, identified by my worldview
Mm-hmm.
or my job or different things like that. But I think out of identity comes purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think only true purpose comes out of answering the question of whose we are. And so I began to wrestle with that, I think. But in that too, it was really beginning to unfold how I was wired instead of being ashamed for my emotions and feeling things deeply and being an empath and all those kinds of things. Like, oh, this is actually a
Yeah.
gift. What do I do with
Yeah.
that? And started doing mission trips,
Mm-hmm.
with my youth group, summers, ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th grade. And then I'm like, you know what, I want to do youth ministry. And so I found Colorado Christian University and did a youth ministry and biblical studies degree and thought I was going to be a youth pastor for the rest of my life. And so
As we
took
all
an
do, right?
amazing job. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Took an amazing job as a youth pastor up in Breckenridge,
Wow.
Colorado, and did that for 5 years and loved it. And uh, there was still a piece missing. And when I had a young man die by suicide and another person overdose in the community, I'm like, there's more.
Yeah.
You're right. I'm not living out the purpose that God has ordained for me fully, and so set me on my journey. But I think that is the easiest way forward and the hardest thing to figure
Mm-hmm.
out. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck is they go, okay, that's great, great, Mark, thanks, appreciate it. Whose am I? I know I'm a child of God, but I don't know how to figure out my
Mm-hmm.
purpose. And I think that's where we do as a society kind of gloss over that. Well, you're a mom, you're a dad,
Yeah.
you're a husband, a wife, you're a teacher, or like, no, those are just, I think those are actually like components of how we're living out our
Right.
purpose, but it's not really what our purpose is. And so,
Wow.
I recently just reevaluated my own purpose and the kind of the clear picture that I got is that I'm the navigation for the mental health journey for anybody that wants to walk with me.
Wow.
And that's a clear
Very
picture, a
clear.
clear purpose, but it brings together everything that I've experienced in my life to this point of I want to help people
Yeah.
navigate, and navigate emotions and mental health. And so I think that's where podcasts like this, I think really, I always tell people everybody needs a life coach and everybody needs a
Yeah.
therapist,
That's right.
because you need to work through the stuff that got you here, and then you need to help somebody help you walk through where you're
Yeah.
going, and that's how we figure those things out, right? But so identity, purpose, and then we have hope,
Mm.
and I think hope is that catalyst of if anything can be thrown at me, and I might have bouts of depression, I might have bouts of anxiety, I might struggle with uh, self-esteem and different things like that, or bouts of feeling lonely. But when I have hope, it's those things are temporary
Mm.
because hope is eternal.
Wow. Wow. So good. Okay, a couple things you said right there that I want to just lean in on. The first of all, you at least are leading us to believe that our purpose is it can be evolving because it has to constitute some of the building blocks of what we've walked through, right? Like
Oh yeah.
it's part of our experience, part of our training, part of our, oh gosh, the author's escaping me right now, but we talk about him quite a bit. The Making of a Leader is the name of the book that he wrote. I will put it in the show notes, but he talks about how there's this like convergence that happens with the training that we undergo, our upbringing, our life experiences, the dark night of the soul that we walk through, where all of that converges
Hmm.
into understanding your purpose. So there's a certain there's certain building blocks that must be put in place for you to start to understand your purpose, which means you got to draw back and go, well, what are these building blocks, and how can I triangulate those things to begin to understand what my purpose is? And then the second thing you're saying right there is that you cannot identify or you can't define your purpose as like a career path, because that career
Hmm.
path might change, and then if you've built your entire purpose on that career path and your identity in that, when the Lord calls you something else or you lose your job or whatever, right? Now you're left in shambles going, what's my purpose? And the reality is your purpose is something deeper than that. And it might just happen to flesh out in this career path during this season,
Hmm.
but you can easily take that purpose and go into a different career path if you need to. The purpose is still the same though.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that people go, well, you've changed things a lot over your life. I'm like, yeah, but I said the thread is that back in after my story, even before my story, of struggle, God instilled in me a deep desire to shepherd and to help
Mm,
people, and that has never changed. It's just become clearer.
wow. Wow. That's so good. Phew. Okay. Can you tell me a little bit more about, well, first of all, let me just say this as a preface. You could probably host the Nothing is Wasted podcast from here on out because the things you're saying right here are things we are constantly talking about. I'm so glad it's coming from you because that means it's not just stuff we came up with. This is stuff that's like
Sure.
universal truths. But you just
Yeah.
said
Oh yeah.
you think everybody needs a life coach and a therapist. So our three circles that we have built our ministry around is content, community, and coaching. And we tell people you need a counselor and you need a coach. We actually offer coaching. We have 30 coaches across the world right now that coach people in targeted areas based on the pain journey that they're going through, right? And so we tell people there's a difference. There's a counselor, there's a coach. You need both of those things. From your vantage point, what would you say the difference between those are? Dive into it a little bit more.
Yeah, because I've transitioned my career a little bit to from counseling to coaching.
Mm,
So I do a lot of coaching now myself, in churches and leaders and that kind of stuff. So I always look at therapy and mental health, and people will disagree with me on this, but it's kind of understanding and figuring out how we got here today.
mm,
So it's developmental, it's historical,
that's
it's
good.
narrative, it's working through trauma, it's working through shame, you know it's creating context and content around uh, who we are and why we're where we're at. And so a lot of healing needs to happen,
Mm,
right? I look at coaching as going, okay, now what? What do I do with all that? Like
wow.
I've got context, I've got understanding, I've got language around it. So how do I, and to be really blunt, how do I not waste it?
Yeah.
Right? Like, how do I not waste my story and what God has done and how I've healed from these different things and how I'm continuing to heal, right? And so I think
Wow.
therapy is something that can be uh, it can be a moment in time, or for like me, I've got a therapist on speed dial
Hmm.
that I will see and check in maybe every quarter, and then if something comes up, that stirs up
Yeah.
past things, right? I'm going to kind of come back. Oh, I still need to process.
Yeah.
Where coaching is okay, like, how many people in the country actually set up goals? Not
Yeah.
very many. Like, how do I live out my purpose? How do I live out, and create legacy and create, a purpose and those ripple effects that are greater than me. Whether it be a mom, that's right now her purpose is staying at home, or a dad that's a stay-at-home dad and
Hmm.
they want to create that legacy and that purpose for their children, whatever that looks like, right? But I think that's what coaching does, and it provides those tools and steps forward.
Wow. Wow. I love that. Counseling really helps you to get a clear picture of how I got to this point. What 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 made me into what I am right now, right? Good, bad, and ugly. And then
Right.
now and the healing that happens there. And then now what do I do with that information? How do I move forward?
Hmm.
And ongoing healing, yes, but also have a plan to be able to say, okay, this is how
Right.
I'm going to be a blessing to the world now with what I'm learning about myself. And man, I hope. Okay, whew.
But that's how we change the narrative. Like, to be honest,
Yep,
right? That's how we change the narrative. It's one story at a time.
that's right. That's right. Um, man, okay, so let's talk a little bit about this book, The Path Out of Loneliness. Okay, I loved it. I was very intrigued by the title because one of the most healing um, resources that I read right after my wife passed away was The Path of Loneliness by Elizabeth Elliot. So then I saw this title, The
Oh
Path
yeah.
Out of Loneliness, and I'm like, yes, this is
Hmm.
awesome because loneliness was something that I had to really deal with after, losing my wife, going like, man, I feel very lonely, right? I feel very this is
Hmm.
and so I'd love to hear a little bit about this idea for you, kind of kind of dissect loneliness a little bit for us and what it does for us, what it does, what it detracts from us as human beings, but also what it can do for us, right?
Sure, absolutely. I think my biggest thing is I am always um, just a big proponent of the fact that we language creates culture and meaning, right? So
Mm,
uh, we need to have a definition. I think this is where we get in trouble a lot of times. Is we don't have um, clear definitions, uh, and so we think we're saying the same thing, but we're not, right?
Yeah.
So I think before I answer that question, let's talk real quick about how I define loneliness. And
Yeah.
people can disagree with me on this, but the way I define loneliness is the state of being unseen or unnoticed, relationally, mentally, emotionally, physically, or spiritually, and it's driven by a lack of purpose or meaning,
Mm.
relationships, and or identity, and it's really marked by a deep sense of hopelessness, right?
Mm.
And so we have to, I have to have all those components, because we talk about holistic health, mind, body,
Yeah.
spirit, relationships. But I really think loneliness is this piece of being unseen or unnoticed.
Mm.
Uh, we can be lonely in a crowd.
Yep.
We can be lonely in a family.
Yep.
We can be completely content and happy by ourselves.
Right.
Like it, there's both sides, right? But I think loneliness, in some ways, is a state of mind
Mm.
that creates a state of being,
Mm.
um, and it's what we tell ourselves about where we're at. And so I'm not saying this to be down on people that are struggling with loneliness, but I would really encourage people to take a step back and go, okay, what meaning have I been making about my circumstances,
Mm.
and how has that contributed to the loneliness? But then also go into that physiological piece of how have my circumstances kind of created some of those roadblocks in me physiologically. And then relationships. Do I have people around me? Do I have a thousand friends and nobody sees me?
Yeah.
Well, okay, why? And being able to take stock of that. But that, to me, you can't do that without a therapist or a coach, right? You
Right.
need somebody else speaking those things into you, because sometimes we get confused. The lies we've been telling ourselves we actually think are truth,
Mm.
and we need to be called out on that kind of stuff. And so I will say people need to understand there's bouts of being lonely,
Mm.
and then there's pervasive loneliness.
Mm.
And I think there's a big difference there. Bouts of being lonely are like COVID, like good
Right.
grief, being shut down and taken away. Isolation breeds that as well. So there's bouts of that, but a lot of us were able to find ways around that through Zoom sessions and phone calls and things we did with our families. But I think pervasive loneliness uh, is this place of being stuck.
Mm.
And so if there are people listening that are feeling like they're in pervasive loneliness, like, okay, like let's call it what it is.
Yeah.
Let's call it out. Um, and then let's take the first step of reaching out to somebody, whether it be a pastor or a coach or a therapist, to go, I need some help figuring out how
Mm.
I got here, and where do I need to go from here. But the reason I chose loneliness is because depression breeds loneliness, anxiety breeds
Mhm.
loneliness, any kind of mental distress or disorder, if we want to look at the DSM-5 diagnostic manual. I think the thread through a lot of those is relational connection and
Yeah.
loneliness. Um, and so I think trying to level the playing field for people that go, well, I don't have a mental disorder, but I'm lonely.
Right.
Okay, well then this is for you too. Let's talk through this. And I talk through a lot. My favorite part of the book is really just recognizing uh, that there isn't a word for relationship in the Hebrew and Greek. It's the word for
Mm.
redemption, and how God recognized that at the
Wow.
fall we had that separation, which bred loneliness and isolation. And so he wasn't going to provide us relationship. He was going to provide us redemption through the blood of
Wow.
his son on the cross.
Wow.
And we see that being traced throughout scripture. And that just like, huh,
Wow.
just made me
I
pause,
didn't realize
and I
that.
actually, I remember sitting here at this desk as I'm diving into scripture, just weeping, going, Lord, man alive, you. Why would I think any different? But here we are, seeing the direct desire for you to redeem us, and redeem
Wow.
is to be made whole again, and to bring back from what was lost.
Wow. Wow.
So I
So
don't know if I answered your question, but that just,
that blows my mind. I didn't realize that. Man, and there's so much to unpack there as well. Because
mhm,
what I was going to say, even before you said that, is that it seems to me these like little bouts of loneliness, right? That those actually, and correct me if you think differently about this, but as I'm kind of processing it, the little bouts of loneliness, what they can do for us is they can if we lean into those bouts of loneliness and begin to get curious about why am I feeling this loneliness right now, then they can actually prevent us from that pervasive sense of loneliness, because
Oh
we can
yeah.
begin to diagnose, okay, why am I not feeling very content with being alone, right?
Right.
In fact, I mean, solitude is a spiritual discipline, right? It's something
Right.
that we should exercise. Jesus did. He went away to a lonely place, it says often in scripture, right? That we should exercise, because the shalom, the peace that God brings to us, is that we can, have these moments where we're alone, where it's just the Lord and me, right? That's it.
Yep.
And sometimes those little bouts of loneliness remind us of that, right? Whether it's because
Hmm.
the Lord, in his sovereignty, he pulled people out of out of your world a little bit, and now you're feeling like, man, where's my community? And so he's reconnecting you to, like, hey, remember, this is where your sustenance is. This is where you are being satisfied to your soul level. And
Yeah.
out of that, then you can serve other people in great community, right?
Oh, absolutely.
As a little addendum, Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about how if you approach community for what you can get out of it, you start to undo that community, because community is all about what we, out of the overflow of what's going on in our own soul, can pour into others, right? And then we receive so much from that as well, and that's what feels like community. But then, the fact that that it seems like that the fact that redemption is really the plan that God has for us, it's almost like he desires to kind of bring us into these spaces where we realize, out of loneliness, man, I need redemption. I need, like,
Yes.
our soul longs for something that's other than what this world can offer.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And I think that's why we need each other. I mean, that's why we need to speak these truths into what's going on and where we're at. Um, and I think the lie that loneliness brings is it's never going to get any better, right? And
Mm.
so we just hole up, we isolate,
Yep.
and that creates, compounding issues. And so for those that are listening, my biggest encouragement is recognize where you're at. Don't
Wow.
judge it. Don't put shame attached to it, but go, okay, what do I need to do to begin to change the course of where I'm
Yeah.
at? And that might be a baby step. That might be reaching out to somebody and going, hey, I'm sorry I haven't talked to you in a long time, but I'm struggling. I need somebody,
Mm.
and just taking that risk. Um,
Yep.
and that's scary, but the
Right.
alternative is staying where you're at.
Right. Can we talk about this for a second? I know we're kind of getting to a point where we need to come to a close for your time, and I want to value that. But you're doing a lot of work with pastors and churches now, as a former pastor yourself, right? And obviously over the past 2 years, with everything that's been going on, COVID, political climate, all that stuff, right? My pastor friends are telling me this is the most isolating, lonely,
Yeah.
discouraging season they've ever felt, right? How do you interject in that space right now, as you're kind of commentating on what's going on, but also shepherding pastors? What would you say to any church leader, pastor, ministry leader that's listening to this right now?
I think it's kind of a compounded response because I think uh, many of them are doing the best they can with what they've got.
Mm.
And so it could be a cultural thing that I want to speak to at the church, the elders, the deacons, those in leadership over that pastor. Do we create a context for them to wrestle, to struggle, to
Mm.
even fail within confines, of expectations? I think a lot of the reasons that we see ministers and pastors and families having issues is we don't give them the opportunity to wrestle and to struggle,
Yeah.
to say, hey, you know what? I struggled with pornography when I was in high school and college, and it popped back up over over COVID,
Mm.
and I recognize that, and I need some support. If that means I need to take a sabbatical and get some work out, whatever. But we're so afraid to even say I'm wrestling with depression or
Mm.
anxiety that we're afraid that our job is going to be on the line. Like I get so frustrated when I hear that a pastor didn't say something because they're afraid that they're going to lose their job. I'm
Right.
like, what kind of community and congregation are we creating
Wow.
that the pastor, the shepherd of the congregation, can't even speak up to their own struggles?
Yeah.
Like that is a toxic culture. And so
Yeah.
that's why I think, I'm seeing this grassroots movement of a lot of organizations and churches going, okay, help us come in and figure out how to create a culture that allows for struggle and
Yep.
allows for wrestling. And then how do we set up that for success, right? We don't want to stay there,
Right.
right?
Right.
But how do we create a culture that champions growth and transparency and vulnerability? And So I think some of the pastors listening, if that's not the culture you're in, one, who can you bring in to help navigate
Mhm.
that? Or two, maybe you need to take a step back and go, is this the right place for you? That's a scary
Yeah.
question too, right?
Yeah.
Am I holding on just for appearance sake, or do I need to really take stock and go, maybe for the sake of my family and the sake of
Mhm.
my own heart and soul, I need to look for a different place to do ministry.
Wow. Phew. Man, Mark, we could sit and talk about this for hours. We really could. This conversation has stirred me up. I don't know if it's because I'm third cup of coffee in right now, or if but these things that you're
Yeah, no,
saying
me
and
too.
my just my holy discontent in life and what I feel like my purpose is in life is just so in line with what you're talking about right now. And so listen, I know our listeners are going to be the same way. They're going to want to know, how can I tune into more of what Dr. Mark Mayfield is doing, what you're saying, what you're writing, so where can we follow your work? Where can we get more connected with you?
Yeah, I'm in the process of kind of redeveloping some things. Once we move, I'm creating a studio, so I'm gonna be starting a
Cool.
podcast here probably this summer called Conversations with Dr. Mayfield, and we're just having these kind of candid conversations with different people and
Wow.
about life, mental health, ministry. You can check me out at drmayfield.com, my website. I've got links to my books. I've got a book for parents on suicide and self-injury that's a free download.
Wow.
Working on my third book right now, that's coming out in the mental health month of 23. Um, and then social media. I should be better at social media. I don't like social media, but I know that it's
Yeah.
important. So,
Yeah.
the Dr. Mayfield for Instagram and Facebook. And then I jumped into the TikTok realm. And so I've got a Dr. Mayfield TikTok as well, but haven't done much with that yet.
Yeah, I love it.
Um, but yeah, I think if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to my Dr. Mayfield page, and we have just a desire to really create some more content moving forward that helped in kind of the discipleship around mental and emotional
Mm,
health. And so that'll be coming here in the next 6 to 8 months.
yeah. Wow, that's great. Well, I know I'll be tuning into that stuff. I mean, you've really stirred me up in this conversation, so I really appreciate it. And I know you've stirred up our community as well. And I know that more than that, you've really helped to shine the light on some stuff, some real struggles that so many of our community is they're wrestling with. And so I appreciate that, and I
Mm.
appreciate both the cerebral and pastoral approach that you take from it. So I thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Hey friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.